The morning of March 27, 1995, in Milan was defined by a sharp, unseasonal cold, with temperatures hovering near 5 degrees Celsius. At precisely 8:30 a.m., the city's business district was transitioning from the early silence of dawn to the rhythmic mechanical noise of a European metropolis. Maurizio Gucci, then 46 years old, and the former head of the world's most iconic fashion dynasty, arrived at his office located at Via Palestro 20. The building, a refined example of Milanese architecture, featured a neoclassical facade with heavy ironwork and a lobby lined with Verde Alpi marble, a high-density metamorphic rock characterized by its deep green hue and white quartz veining. Maurizio was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit of Super 150s wool and carried a stack of international newspapers and magazines. He was a man who, despite losing control of his family's company 2 years prior, still moved with the practiced cadence of the global elite. As he began to ascend the short flight of steps toward the elevator, a man emerged from the shadows of the street. The assailant was wearing a nondescript brown jacket, a tactical choice for blending into the early morning crowd. He drew a 7.65mm semi-automatic pistol, a caliber favored by professional hits for its manageable recoil and sufficient stopping power at close range. The first 3 shots were fired in rapid succession into Maurizio's back and shoulder. The physics of the impact propelled him forward onto the marble. The fourth and final shot, the colpo di grazia, was delivered with clinical precision into his right temple. The 7.65mm projectile shattered the temporal bone, causing instantaneous cessation of neurological function. Maurizio Gucci, a man whose net worth at the time of the sale of his shares in 1993 was approximately $170 million, a figure equivalent to $385 million in 2026 purchasing power, was dead before his body fully settled on the stone. The violence was not contained to Gucci. Giuseppe Onorato, the 43-year-old building porter, was sweeping the entrance when the gunfire erupted. In a state of shock, he moved toward the gunman. The assassin fired twice more, hitting Onorato in the arm. The porter survived, becoming the only eyewitness to the execution. The shooter calmly retreated to a getaway vehicle idling at the curb, a 1992 Renault Clio. The Clio was the quintessential invisible car of the 1990s, a front-wheel drive hatchback with a 1.2-liter engine, mass-produced and utterly unremarkable, making it the perfect tool for an escape through Milan's narrow, winding streets. By the time the Italian state police, the Polizia di Stato, arrived to cordon off the area with yellow tape, the assassin had vanished into the morning traffic. At the exact moment the paramedics were covering Maurizio's body with a white sheet, his ex-wife, Patrizia Reggiani, was in her palatial apartment on Via San Spirito, located in the heart of the Quadrilatero della Moda. The apartment was a fortress of 18th-century antiques and velvet upholstery. Patrizia opened her personal diary, a custom-made Cartier volume bound in heavy black silk. With a steady hand, she inscribed a single word in Greek, Paradisos. The entry was timed for the morning of the murder. In the vacuum of the 1995 Italian economy, which was still reeling from the Mani Pulite, clean hands corruption scandals that had dismantled the country's political class, the death of a Gucci was more than a tabloid headline. It was the collapse of a symbol. The investigation would initially focus on international business rivalries and the complex web of offshore accounts tied to the InvestCorp takeover. No one yet dared to look at the woman who had just written Paradise in a silk-bound book. Behind the mourning veil Patrizia would soon don lay a calculated history of resentment, a transformation from a social climber to a widow by design. Patrizia Reggiani was born on December 2, 1948, in Vignola, a small town in the Emilia-Romagna region known primarily for its cherry production and its strategic position along the trade routes of northern Italy. She was not born into the aristocracy she would eventually dominate. Her mother, Silvana Barbieri, was a waitress and a woman of fierce, focused ambition who viewed her daughter as a long-term investment. Patrizia's biological father was a non-entity, a shadow that Silvana quickly replaced when she captured the attention of Ferdinando Reggiani. Ferdinando was a self-made industrialist who had built a lucrative trucking and logistics empire during Italy's post-war economic miracle, the Miracolo Economico. In 1950s Italy, the logistics sector was the backbone of reconstruction. The demand for heavy transport to move steel and masonry meant that men like Reggiani accumulated wealth at a rate that far outpaced the traditional landed gentry. By the time Patrizia was 12, she was being groomed for the high society of Milan. Her education was not merely academic, it was an apprenticeship in the aesthetics of power. Silvana ensured her daughter wore only the finest silks and was trained in the rigid social etiquette of the Milanese bene, the upper crust. In the late 1960s, Milan was undergoing a radical transformation. The city was shifting from an industrial hub to the global capital of prêt-à-porter, Ciu. The economy was booming, with the lira maintaining a surprising stability against the dollar. A high-end cocktail dress in 1968 cost approximately 150,000 lira, which, when adjusted through the decades of inflation and the euro transition, represents a 2026 value of nearly $4,200. Patrizia was frequently seen in the most exclusive salotti, private salons where the industrial elite mingled with the remnants of the nobility. In November 1970, the paths of the Reggiani and Gucci families crossed at a themed debutante party. The event was a meticulously curated display of wealth, featuring crystal chandeliers and a staff-to-guest ratio of 1:1. Maurizio Gucci, the grandson of the company's founder Guccio Gucci, was 22 years old and pathologically shy. He was the son of Rodolfo Gucci, a man who had spent his youth as a film actor under the stage name Maurizio d'Ancora, appearing in over 40 films at the legendary Cinecittà Studios in Rome. Rodolfo's cinematic background had left him with a theatrical sense of dignity and a profound distrust of anyone he deemed common. When Maurizio met Patrizia that night, he was captivated by her confidence. She wore a bright red dress, a color that stood out against the muted tones of the Milanese debutantes. She famously looked at him and didn't see a man, but a vessel for her ultimate ambition. The resistance to their union was immediate and forensic. Rodolfo Gucci utilized his connections within the Italian security apparatus to conduct a private background check on the Reggianis. He viewed Ferdinando's trucking wealth as new money, tainted by the diesel and dust of the autostrada. He warned Maurizio that Patrizia was a social climber who would eventually destroy the family legacy. Rodolfo's internal memo to his son described her as una rivista, a woman who forgets nothing of the price, but knows nothing of the value. At the time, the Gucci brand was generating an annual revenue of approximately $25 million, $180 million in 2026 value, and Rodolfo feared a marriage would dilute the brand's carefully guarded prestige. He threatened to disinherit Maurizio, a move that would have stripped him of his shares in a company that was then the ultimate symbol of the jet-set era. Maurizio, for the first time in his life, defied the patriarch. He chose the woman who promised him an identity outside of his father's shadow. They married in 1972 at the Church of Santa Maria della Pace. The guest list was a map of the era's tensions. The Gucci side of the aisle was notably empty, a stark contrast to the Reggiani side, which was filled with the nouveau riche and the ambitious. The wedding was the opening gambit in a war of succession. Patrizia had successfully infiltrated the most protected fashion dynasty in Europe. She had secured the name, but she was about to realize that the Gucci family was not a united front, but a collection of warring factions, each more ruthless than the last. Rodolfo's prophecy began to take shape as the couple boarded a flight to New York, leaving the traditional constraints of Milan behind for the unbridled excess of the American market. The reconciliation between the Gucci patriarch and his son was not a matter of sentiment, but of geopolitical necessity and brand expansion. By 1972, the American market had become the primary engine for European luxury growth. The United States was navigating the tail end of the post-World War II economic boom. Even as the Nixon shock, the cancellation of the direct convertibility of the United States dollar to gold sent ripples through international currency markets. For the Gucci family, the Golden Wedding in 1972 was the catalyst for a strategic relocation to New York City. Patrizia Reggiani, now legally Patrizia Gucci, transitioned from the provincial anxieties of Milan to the absolute epicenter of global capitalism. The couple's headquarters was the Olympic Tower at 641 Fifth Avenue. Completed in 1975, the building was a technical marvel of its time, designed by the architectural firm Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. It was the first mixed-use skyscraper in New York to utilize a reinforced concrete frame with a curtain wall of dark-tinted glass, a departure from the masonry-heavy towers of the previous era. Maurizio and Patrizia occupied an 800-square-meter penthouse spread across the 46th and 47th floors. The interior was a masterpiece of 1970s maximalism. Walls upholstered in silk, floors of rare Afghan lapis lazuli, and a climate control system that was cutting edge for the decade. The acquisition cost was approximately $1.2 million in 1976, which in 2026 purchasing power represents a staggering $7.4 million investment for a secondary residence. Patrizia's social strategy in New York was surgical. She understood that in the 1970s, luxury was moving away from discreet inheritance and toward visible, high-impact branding. The macroeconomic environment favored this. The rise of the me decade created a vacuum that the Gucci logo, the interlocking double G, filled perfectly. Patrizia commanded a domestic staff of 12 and organized dinners where the floral arrangements alone, consisting of imported white lilies and rare orchids, cost $10,000 per event. In 2026 terms, that is $62,000 spent on organic matter that would be discarded within 48 hours. She cultivated friendships with the Kennedy family and the burgeoning art elite, positioning herself not as a wife, but as a sovereign. During this period, the Maurizia vanity plate on their chauffeured Bentley became a symbol of their combined identity. Technical precision extended to their mobile assets. Their fleet included a customized 1979 Cadillac Seville, featuring a Gucci-designed interior with the signature red and green webbed seatbelts and a vinyl top embossed with the family crest. This was the era of the Gucci-fication of everything from lighters to wall coverings. However, the archive reveals a darker technical reality. While the couple lived in a state of perpetual victory, the company's internal accounting was becoming a labyrinth of tax evasion and family infighting. Rodolfo, eventually won over by the birth of his granddaughter Alessandra in 1976, granted Patrizia access to the inner sanctum of the family's holdings. He saw her as the only force capable of stabilizing Maurizio's inherent indecisiveness. It was during a 1979 interview with a television crew in their Manhattan penthouse that Patrizia uttered the phrase that would define her legacy. "It is better to cry in a Rolls Royce than to be happy on a bicycle." The quote was not merely a provocation, it was a mission statement. Patrizia had successfully transformed a shy heir into a global titan, believing she had secured a permanent seat at the table of the world's most powerful fashion dynasty. But as the 1980s approached, the very greed she encouraged in Maurizio began to mutate into a desire for independence that did not include her. The death of Rodolfo Gucci in May 1983 marked the end of the old world order and the beginning of Patrizia's most aggressive power play. Maurizio inherited his father's 50% stake in the company, a transfer of wealth that, despite complex Italian inheritance laws of the time, was valued at over $200 million, approximately $650 million in 2026. However, the remaining 50% was held by Maurizio's uncle, Aldo Gucci, the man responsible for the brand's global expansion, and Aldo's 3 sons. Patrizia viewed this 50-50 split not as a partnership, but as a technical failure that needed to be rectified. She became Maurizio's General Chief of Staff, engineering a corporate coup that would span 3 continents and several years of litigation. The strategy was one of radical centralization. At the time, the Gucci brand was suffering from brand dilution, a technical term for the over-licensing of a trademark. There were over 22,000 different Gucci-branded items on the market, ranging from cheap canvas sneakers to plastic keychains. This mass-market saturation was profitable in the short term, but was destroying the brand's long-term Veblen good status, a product for which demand increases as the price increases. Patrizia pushed Maurizio to cut these licenses ruthlessly. She understood the macroeconomic shift of the 1980s, the birth of the modern luxury conglomerate, similar to the early stages of LVMH. To compete, Gucci had to be exclusive, expensive, and most importantly, under a single command. The tactical execution was brutal. To gain full control, Maurizio, under Patrizia's guidance, had to turn against his own family. They utilized a series of legal maneuvers to exploit the internal dissent between Aldo and his son, Paolo Gucci. Paolo, a frustrated designer who wanted to launch his own Paolo Gucci line, was the weak link. In a boardroom meeting in 1982 that turned physical, Paolo was struck with a tape recorder by his own family members. Patrizia saw an opportunity in his resentment. She encouraged Maurizio to provide Paolo with the legal support necessary to sue his father, Aldo, for tax evasion in the United States. This led to the 81-year-old Aldo Gucci being sentenced to a year in American federal prison in 1986. With the patriarch incapacitated, the technical path to total control was clear. Behind the scenes, the cost of this corporate warfare was astronomical. The couple's lifestyle reached a fever pitch of expenditure. Patrizia's personal clothing budget alone was estimated at $1 million per year, roughly $4.5 million in 2026 value. She insisted on traveling via a Gulfstream II, a twin-engine business jet that burned nearly 400 gallons of fuel per hour. The technical logistics of their lives required a small army of lawyers, accountants, and consultants. However, Maurizio's management style was flawed. He possessed the vision for luxury, but lacked the operational discipline to manage the debt incurred during the buyouts of his cousins. The company began to bleed cash at a rate of $2 million per month. As Maurizio finally took his seat as the undisputed chairman of Gucci, he began to resent the woman who had paved his way with the blood of his kin. He had become the king Patrizia wanted, but he no longer wanted a queen who reminded him of the price of his crown. The corporate strategy was succeeding, but the marital foundation was fracturing under the weight of their shared ruthlessness. Patrizia had taught Maurizio how to dispose of anyone who stood in his way, never realizing that she would be the next person on his list. In the taxonomy of maritime excess, the Creole stands as a singular obsession of engineering and superstition. Acquired by Maurizio Gucci in 1983, shortly after his father's death, the three-masted schooner was not merely a vessel, it was a 65-meter statement of total vertical integration. Built in 1927 by the legendary Camper and Nicholson's Yard in Gosport, England, the Creole was the largest wooden sailing yacht ever constructed. Its hull was a masterwork of composite engineering, featuring teak planking over a steel frame, a technical choice that provided the rigidity of a modern warship with the aesthetic warmth of a classic estate. Maurizio purchased the yacht in a state of decay from the Danish government, which had used it as a training ship, for a sum that, after the exhaustive 6-year restoration, totaled approximately $35 million. In 2026 purchasing power, this reflects a capital injection of over $110 million. The restoration was a logistical nightmare that Patrizia supervised with the intensity of a military campaign. The technical specifications were uncompromising. Every inch of the mahogany interior had to be hand-polished to a mirror finish. The masts, soaring nearly 50 meters above the waterline, were replaced with Oregon pine of a specific grain density to withstand the torque of the massive sail area. The rigging was a complex web of modern high-tensile synthetics disguised as traditional hemp cordage. To maintain the Creole, a permanent crew of 15 was required, including engineers specifically trained in the maintenance of its twin MTU diesel engines, which provided 200 horsepower for transit when the winds failed. The annual operating budget, encompassing docking fees in Saint-Tropez, fuel, specialized maritime insurance, and a full-time chef, hovered around $5 million, or 15 million, $5 million today. The Creole carried a historical weight that the superstitious Patrizia initially chose to ignore. Its previous owner, the Greek shipping tycoon Stavros Niarchos, had seen his wife, Eugenia Livanos, die under mysterious circumstances aboard a different vessel in his fleet. But the Creole itself was whispered to be cursed after a string of maritime accidents and personal tragedies involving its custodians. For Patrizia, however, the yacht was the ultimate tool for social dominance. In the mid-1980s, as the global economy surged under the deregulation of Reaganomics and Thatcherism, the Mediterranean became a theater of competitive consumption. The Guccis used the Creole to host the great and the good, from members of the Grimaldi family to the titans of the burgeoning tech and media sectors. Patrizia dictated every detail. The crew's uniforms were custom-tailored in Milan. The silver service was heavy-gauge sterling. The wine cellar was stocked with 1961 Petrus. Macroeconomically, the ownership of the Creole signaled that Gucci was no longer just a leather goods company. It was a lifestyle conglomerate. This was the era of the billionaire's row in the harbors of the French Riviera, where wealth was measured in meters of length and the quality of one's radar array. But the technical perfection of the ship masked the financial rot underneath. Maurizio was financing this maritime fortress through increasingly complex debt instruments and the liquidation of family real estate. Patrizia, reigning as the admiral of the Gucci Navy, was oblivious to the fact that the ship's hull was more stable than her marriage. She believed the Creole had cemented her status as an untouchable aristocrat, failing to realize that on the open sea, the person at the helm has the power to change course without warning. The year 1985 was a threshold of profound transition for the Italian Republic and the Gucci dynasty. Domestically, Italy was experiencing the anni di piombo, years of lead, fading into the Milano da Bere, an era characterized by a frantic, hedonistic pursuit of success and luxury. The GDP was growing at a rate of nearly 3%, and the Italian fashion industry was becoming the nation's primary export engine. Architecturally, the Guccis moved their primary operations to a sprawling villa in the heart of Milan's San Spirito district. The property was a fortress of 16th-century classicism, featuring a central courtyard and a private chapel. The technical maintenance of such an estate required a logistical network of specialized restorers, security personnel, and a domestic staff that operated with the silence of a Swiss watch. However, the internal stability of the House of Gucci was an illusion. On May 22, 1985, Maurizio Gucci packed a small leather overnight bag, a prototype from the upcoming autumn collection, and told Patrizia he was flying to Florence for a routine board meeting. He never returned. The mechanical precision of their life was shattered not by a scream, but by a messenger. 2 days later, a mutual friend arrived at the San Spirito villa to inform Patrizia that the marriage was over. Maurizio had moved into a separate residence and intended to seek a legal separation. In the legal context of mid-80s Italy, divorce was still a relatively recent and socially radioactive phenomenon, having been legalized only in 1970 under Lega No. 898. For a woman like Patrizia, whose entire identity was surgically attached to the Gucci brand, the separation was not just a personal rejection. It was a corporate delisting. The other woman in this narrative was not a sudden arrival, but a slow-burning presence. Maurizio had reconnected with Paola Franchi, a childhood friend and former model who possessed the tall, blonde, effortless elegance that was the antithesis of Patrizia's calculated, dark intensity. Paola lived in a world of understated luxury, a stark contrast to Patrizia's more is more philosophy. While Patrizia viewed the Gucci name as a shield and a scepter, Paola seemingly saw Maurizio as a man. This psychological shift was unbearable for Patrizia. She began a campaign of harassment that utilized the technology of the era. Dozens of recorded cassette tapes were sent to Maurizio, filled with her voice, sometimes whispering, sometimes screaming, reminding him that he was nothing without her. The cost of these recordings, in terms of the private investigators she hired to track his movements, exceeded $200,000 annually, $580,000 today. Patrizia's obsession now turned toward the legal and financial mechanics of the separation. She demanded an alimony settlement that would maintain her status at the pinnacle of the 1%. Initial figures discussed were in the range of $100,000 per month, which in 2026 value equates to nearly $300,000. She refused to stop using the Gucci name, citing that she was more Gucci than any of them. She studied the company's bylaws, looking for a technicality that would allow her to retain her seat on the board or veto Maurizio's decisions. She transformed the Via San Spirito into a bunker of resentment, surrounded by her furs and jewels, which she catalogued with obsessive detail as if they were the only evidence of her existence. Maurizio had underestimated the technical depth of Patrizia's rage. He had taught her the art of the corporate takeover, and she was now preparing to apply those lessons to his own life. The mask of the perfect socialite had not just slipped, it had dissolved. In its place was a woman who realized that while she could no longer be the wife of the king, she could still be the architect of his downfall. By 1993, the technical reality of the House of Gucci was one of terminal insolvency. Under Maurizio's leadership, the company was hemorrhaging cash at a rate of approximately $2.1 million per month, a figure that in 2026 value translates to a loss of $5.4 million every 30 days. The macroeconomic climate of the early 1990s was unforgiving. The global recession triggered by the 1990 oil price shock and the subsequent slowdown in luxury consumption had exposed the flaws in Maurizio's exclusivity at all costs strategy. While he had successfully pruned the brand of its cheap licenses, he had failed to replace that lost revenue with operational efficiency. The company's debt to banks, primarily Credit Suisse and various Italian lenders, had ballooned to over $40 million, $102 million today. The technical mechanism of the takeover was orchestrated by Investcorp, a Manama, Bahrain-based private equity firm led by Namir Kurdar. Investcorp specialized in the corporatization of family-owned luxury brands, having already acquired Tiffany & Co. and Saks Fifth Avenue. Their strategy was cold and data-driven. They sought to decouple the Gucci name from the Gucci family, viewing the internal blood feuds as a brand risk that inhibited growth. In September 1993, Maurizio was backed into a corner, facing personal bankruptcy and the total seizure of his assets, including the Creole and the Olympic Tower apartment. He was forced to sell his remaining 50% stake to Investcorp for $170 million. In 2026 purchasing power, this buyout represents a $435 million liquidation. For the first time in 72 years, the House of Gucci had no Guccis in its boardroom. For Patrizia, this was the ultimate technological failure of her design. She had engineered Maurizio's rise to power only to watch him surrender the family's DNA to a board of directors. She viewed the sale not as a financial rescue, but as a theft of identity. The branding of the company underwent a radical shift. Domenico De Sole was promoted to CEO, and in 1994, a young American designer named Tom Ford was elevated to creative director. Ford's technical approach to fashion, highly sexualized, sleek, and minimalist, was a direct assault on the traditional, bourgeois aesthetic Patrizia had spent decades cultivating. The archive reveals her frantic communications from this era. She wrote letters to De Sole and Kurdar, claiming the Gucci spirit could not be sold and that they were merely custodians of her name. Simultaneously, the secondary character of Paola Franchi moved from the shadows to center stage. She and Maurizio moved into a sprawling 18th century apartment on Corso Venezia, an area known for its palazzi nobiliari. The apartment's maintenance was a feat of architectural preservation, requiring specialized climate control for its frescoes and antique boiseries. As Maurizio began the legal process to marry Paola, Patrizia realized that her alimony, already a point of contention, would be significantly diluted under Italian law if a new wife and potential new heirs entered the picture. Her settlement of $1.1 million per year, $2.8 million in 2026, was technically sufficient for a high luxury life, but it was insufficient for a woman who viewed herself as the rightful dowager queen of a fashion empire. She was being erased from the ledgers of history, and her response was to seek a final, irreversible audit of Maurizio's existence. The era of betrayal concluded with a shift in Patrizia's social circle. Ostracized by the Milanese elite, who now viewed her as a litigious ex-wife, she retreated into a shadowy network of peripheral characters who operated on the fringes of the law and the occult. She began to focus on the logistics of permanent removal, seeking a technical solution for a man she now referred to only as the object of my contempt. In 1992, a medical event provided a critical technical layer to Patrizia Reggiani's psychological descent. She was diagnosed with a brain tumor, specifically a meningioma, a slow-growing tumor that arises from the meninges, the protective membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord. While usually benign, its placement can exert significant pressure on the frontal lobes, which govern executive function, impulse control, and personality. The surgery to remove the tumor was a complex craniotomy performed at the San Raffaele Hospital in Milan. The technical procedure involved the temporary removal of a bone flap from the skull to allow neurosurgeons to excise the mass. While the surgery was deemed successful, friends and family noted a permanent shift in her cognitive landscape, a heightened state of obsessive focus, and a total lack of empathy. During her recovery, Patrizia solidified her bond with Giuseppina Pina Auriemma, a woman from Naples who functioned as a vidente, or psychic. In the early 1990s, the industry of the occult in Italy was a multi-billion lira economy, catering to a wealthy class that had lost faith in traditional institutions following the Tangentopoli corruption scandals. Pina was not merely a spiritual advisor. She was a logistical conduit. She moved into Patrizia's inner sanctum, acting as a gatekeeper and a human shield against the outside world. Their relationship was built on a foundation of mutual financial parasitism. Patrizia paid Pina for cleansing rituals and tarot readings, with payments often disguised as luxury gifts or cash transfers that reached upwards of $200,000 in today's value. The technical planning for the murder began not with a professional hitman, but with a series of inquiries made through Pina's Neapolitan connections. Patrizia's request was specific. She wanted a clean execution that could not be traced back to her. She was obsessed with the mechanics of the perfect crime. In the macro context of the mid-90s, Italy was plagued by organized crime violence, yet Patrizia's plot was remarkably amateurish in its inception. Pina eventually contacted Ivano Savioni, a debt-ridden night porter at the Hotel Adlon in Milan. Savioni, in turn, recruited Orazio Cicala, a failed restaurateur with mounting gambling debts. Cicala was tasked with finding the triggermen, eventually selecting Benedetto Ceraulo, a man whose only qualification was a desperate need for money and a total lack of moral friction. The price for the hit was set at 600 million lira, which in 2026 purchasing power equals approximately $780,000. The logistics of the payment were handled with reckless transparency. Patrizia withdrew large sums of cash from her accounts, assuming that her status as a Gucci would shield her from banking scrutiny. The group used standard 1990s communication technology, unencrypted landlines and public payphones, to coordinate the surveillance of Maurizio's movements. They mapped out his daily routine, the 8:30 a.m. arrival at Via Palestro, the specific path he took to avoid the morning crowds, and the lack of professional security. Maurizio, ever the aristocrat, believed his name was his protection. He did not realize he was being hunted by a porter, a gambler, and a psychic. As the date of March 27, 1995 approached, the Shadow Circle had completed its technical rehearsal. Patrizia was no longer just a woman scorned. She was the CEO of a murder-for-hire startup. She provided the intelligence, the funding, and the motive. The final variable was the execution itself. While she sat in her apartment surrounded by the material evidence of her former life, her employees were positioned in the cold Milanese morning, waiting for the man who had dared to sell the name she believed was hers by divine right. The contract was signed in blood, and the payment was waiting in a safe deposit box. But the most expensive mistake Patrizia made was the one she recorded in her own diary. The finalization of the divorce between Maurizio Gucci and Patrizia Reggiani in 1994 was a masterclass in legal attrition and fiscal bitterness. Under the civil codes of the Italian Republic, specifically the evolving interpretations of the 1970 divorce law, the settlement was intended to reflect the standard of living maintained during the marriage. However, the technical definition of necessity for a Gucci was far removed from the reality of the average Italian citizen. The court awarded Patrizia an annual alimony of 1.1 million Swiss francs, a currency chosen for its stability against the fluctuating Italian lira. In 2026 purchasing power, this settlement equates to approximately $285 million per year. To the public and the court, it was a staggering sum. To Patrizia, it was an insult she famously characterized as a bowl of lentils. This biblical reference to Esau selling his birthright for a meager meal was not hyperbolic in her mind. She viewed the loss of the Gucci trademark, her birthright by marriage, as a catastrophic devaluation of her personhood. The macroeconomic landscape of 1994 Italy was defined by the Second Republic transition. The lira was under immense pressure within the European monetary system, and the cost of maintaining a high aristocracy lifestyle in Milan was skyrocketing. A single evening gown from a major couture house in 1994 cost approximately 15 million lira, which is roughly $18,500 in today's value. Patrizia's overheads were astronomical. The maintenance of the 12-room apartment on Via San Spirito, the salaries of her specialized domestic staff, and the legal fees for her ongoing litigation against Maurizio. She was trapped in a financial paradox. She was a multi-millionaire who felt impoverished because she no longer had access to the unlimited credit lines of a global fashion empire. She spent hours with her lawyers, seeking technical loopholes in the prenuptial and postnuptial agreements, specifically looking for ways to claim a percentage of the $170 million Maurizio had received from Investcorp. Simultaneously, the new Gucci was ascending without her. Under the technical direction of Domenico De Sole and the creative vision of Tom Ford, the brand was preparing its 1995 Fall-Winter collection, which would later be credited with saving the company. Ford's use of jewel-toned velvets and satin shirts, fabrics that required specialized Italian looms and high-denier weaving techniques, was creating a halo effect around the brand. As the brand's valuation began to climb toward its eventual multi-billion-dollar IPO, Patrizia watched from the sidelines of her velvet-lined bunker. Her hatred was fueled by the technical reality that as the company became more successful, her exclusion became more absolute. She was no longer invited to the Socialite fashion shows. Her name was a liability to the new corporate image of sleek, Americanized luxury. The secondary figure of Paola Franchi became the focal point of Patrizia's terminal rage. Paola was a designer and a member of the upper middle class who represented the discreet wealth Maurizio now craved. Their life together in the Corso Venezia apartment was a technical antithesis to Patrizia's. While Patrizia's home was filled with heavy, gilded 18th century antiques that required constant humidification and restoration, Maurizio and Paola favored a more contemporary, minimalist aesthetic, incorporating pieces by Gio Ponti and lighting by Artemide. The engineering of their new life was a deliberate erasure of the Patrizia era. When Patrizia learned that Maurizio was planning to marry Paola in a ceremony at the Vela d'Oro, she understood the technical legal consequence. Under Italian inheritance law, a new wife would be entitled to a significant portion of Maurizio's estate, potentially displacing Patrizia's daughters, Alessandra and Allegra. Patrizia's psychological state during this period was documented in a series of psychiatric evaluations. Doctors noted an obsessive-compulsive fixation on the Gucci trademark. She viewed the name not as a brand, but as a biological component of her identity. She began to carry a black book where she calculated the cost of Maurizio's betrayals down to the last lira. She was no longer looking for a legal settlement. She was looking for a total system override. She began to consult with Pina Auriemma not just for spiritual guidance, but for strategic disposal. The bowl of lentils had turned into a poison she was ready to serve back to the man who had dared to price her out of his life. The legal battle had reached a stalemate, and in the world of Patrizia Reggiani, when the law failed to provide the desired outcome, The only remaining option was the implementation of a more permanent, extrajudicial contract. In the months leading up to March 1995, Patrizia Reggiani's residence on Via San Spirito transformed into a fortress of technical paranoia. The apartment, a sprawling complex of historical significance, was outfitted with heavy security doors and an internal communication system that allowed her to monitor the movements of her staff. However, the true surveillance was external. Patrizia had diverted a portion of her alimony, approximately $300,000 in today's currency, toward a network of private investigators and informants. Their task was to provide a minute-by-minute log of Maurizio Gucci's life. They documented his commute to the Via Palestro office, his lunch habits at the Biffi Scala, and his weekend retreats to St. Moritz. The technical data gathered was precise. Maurizio moved with a predictable, aristocratic cadence, often walking without bodyguards, believing that the refined streets of Milan were a safe haven. The logistics of the murder plot were handled with a bizarre mixture of high-stakes intent and low-level incompetence. Pina Oriema, the psychic conduit, had recruited a cell of conspirators who represented the desperate fringes of the Milanese economy. Ivano Savioni, the night porter at the Hotel Adlon, was the intermediary. His role was to manage the human resources of the hit. He was a man drowning in debt, living in a cramped apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' televisions, a far cry from the sound-insulated halls of the Gucci estates. Savioni brought in Orazio Cicala, a former restaurant owner whose gambling debts to various sottocapo of the Milanese underworld had made him a man with nothing to lose. Cicala was the designated driver, selected for his knowledge of Milan's labyrinthine Zona Traffico Limitato, ZTL, the restricted traffic zones that required intimate knowledge to navigate without alerting the Vigili Urbani. The triggerman, Benedetto Ciraulo, was a car salesman with a failing business. His selection was a technical error in judgment by the group. He had no professional history as an assassin. He was provided with a 7.65mm semi-automatic pistol, a weapon chosen for its compact size, roughly 160mm in length, making it easy to conceal beneath a standard jacket. The 7.65mm Browning, also known as Iber 32 ACP, is a caliber that generates low muzzle flash and noise, a technical advantage for a hit in a quiet, residential business district like Via Palestro. The cost of the weapon on the black market at the time was roughly 2 million lira, 2,500 $2 today. The group conducted several dry runs, tracing the route from Cicala's residence to the office building, timing the lights and the pedestrian flow. Patrizia's involvement in the technical planning was direct and uncompromising. She provided the funding in a series of cash installments to avoid the segnalazione operazione sospetta, suspicious transaction report, that Italian banks were beginning to implement more rigorously. The total contract of 600 million lira, $780,000 in 2026, was a fortune to the conspirators, but a manageable capital expenditure for Patrizia. She viewed the payment as a business expense for the recovery of her status. During this period, her paranoia intensified. She began to record her own thoughts on a micro-cassette recorder, a Sony TCM series, documenting her right to eliminate the man she believed had stolen her life. The tapes revealed a woman who had meticulously deconstructed Maurizio's existence until he was no longer a human being, but a glitch in her reality that needed to be deleted. Macroeconomically, Milan in 1995 was a city of deep shadows. The Mani Pulite investigations had left a power vacuum that was being filled by a more fragmented, desperate class of criminals. The choice of a Renault Clio as the getaway car was a stroke of unintended genius. The Clio, with its 3.7-meter length and tight turning radius, was engineered for the very streets the assassins would use to vanish. It was the most common car in Italy. In a sea of thousands of identical green and gray hatchbacks, a Renault Clio was statistically invisible to the Milanese police's surveillance cameras of the era, which lacked the high-resolution sensors and license plate recognition software of 2026. On the night of March 26th, Patrizia sat in her darkened study, surrounded by the archival remains of her marriage. Photo albums from the Olympic Tower, invitations to the Creole, and the heavy silk-bound Cartier diary. She was the architect of a machine that was now in motion. The technical preparation was complete. The shadow circle was in place. She had paid for a result, and as she wrote the word Paradisos in anticipation, she believed she was finally closing the ledger on the house of Gucci. She had built a fortress of paranoia to protect her secret, but she had forgotten that a fortress is also a cage. The sun would rise on Via Palestro in 8 hours, and with it, the final audit of Maurizio Gucci would begin. The investigation into the assassination of Maurizio Gucci lasted 675 days, a period during which the Italian judicial system and the Polizia di Stato moved with a deliberate, albeit glacial, precision. Initially, the Polizia di Stato's Squadra Mobile focused on international financial leads, suspecting a hit orchestrated by offshore rivals or disgruntled associates from the InvestCorp transition. They meticulously audited Maurizio's foreign accounts, particularly those in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, looking for the technical signature of a corporate liquidation gone wrong. However, the breakthrough came not from a Swiss bank, but from a wiretap on a low-level informant. The technical apparatus of the Italian state, refined during the Maxi Processo against the Mafia in the 1980s, was now turned toward the Quadrilatero della Moda. On January 31, 1997, at 4 a.m., the investigation reached its kinetic climax. Filippo Nini, the lead investigator, arrived at the apartment on Via San Spirito with a warrant for the arrest of Patrizia Reggiani. The temperature in Milan was 2 degrees Celsius. Patrizia, displaying a profound detachment from the reality of her situation, did not surrender in silence. She insisted on dressing for the occasion, a process that took over an hour as the police waited in her foyer. She emerged wearing a full-length vison, mink coat, a garment that in the mid-1990s was the ultimate technical expression of the Italian fur industry's dominance. A high-quality mink coat of that length required approximately 40 to 60 pelts and was valued at $50,000, roughly $105,000 in 2026 purchasing power. Adorned with gold jewelry and carrying a leather handbag, she walked toward the police car as if she were boarding a private jet. She was convinced that this was a temporary administrative error, a glitch that her lawyers would rectify by noon. The trial, which commenced in June 1998 at the Court d'Assises in Milan, was a technical autopsy of a social dynasty. The Italian Penal Code, specifically Article 575 and 577 concerning omicidio volontario, premeditated murder, carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. The prosecution presented the Cartier diary with its Paradisos entry as the primary smoking gun, a piece of archival evidence that documented the premeditation with chronological certainty. The defense, led by a team of high-cost litigators whose fees exceeded $5,000 per hour in today's value, attempted a technical insanity plea. They argued that the 1992 brain tumor surgery had permanently damaged Patrizia's frontal lobes, the region responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning. However, the court's psychiatric experts, utilizing early-generation MRI and CT scan analysis, concluded that while her personality was theatrical and narcissistic, she was legally sane and fully cognizant of the logistics of the hit. Patrizia was sentenced to 29 years in prison, later reduced to 26 on appeal. Her new residence was the Casa Circondariale di Milano San Vittore, a 19th-century radial prison designed according to the panopticon architectural theory. Built between 1872 and 1879, San Vittore's technical layout consists of 6 wings radiating from a central rotunda, a design intended for total surveillance and the isolation of inmates. For Patrizia, the transition was a catastrophic failure of her reality, yet she adapted with a bizarre, aristocratic resilience. She referred to the prison as San Vittore Residence and successfully negotiated privileges that allowed her to keep a pet ferret named Bambi in her cell. She spent her days tending to a small garden of ivy and potted plants, maintaining a wardrobe of designer tracksuits and silk scarves. She famously refused a work release program in 2011, stating to the court, I've never worked in my life, and I'm certainly not going to start now. Macroeconomically, during her incarceration, the brand she so desperately craved to own was undergoing a multi-billion-dollar transformation. While Patrizia was confined to a 10-square-meter cell with limestone walls and iron bars, the Gucci Group was being absorbed into the Kering conglomerate, then PPR, led by François-Henri Pinault. The technical valuation of the company skyrocketed from the $170 million Maurizio had received to a global market capitalization of over $15 billion by the mid-2000s. The family name was no longer a lineage. It was a high-performance financial asset. Patrizia's daughters, Alessandra and Allegra, who had inherited Maurizio's $400 million estate in 2026 terms, eventually distanced themselves from their mother, moving to Switzerland to escape the gravitational pull of the scandal. Patrizia Reggiani had entered San Vittore as Lady Gucci, but as the decades passed, she became a ghost in the machine of the luxury industry. She had paid for a paraiso and found herself in a panopticon, where the only thing she could truly own was her silence. But even that was about to be sold. Patrizia Reggiani was released from San Vittore in October 2016, having served 18 years of her sentence. She emerged into a Milan that was technologically and culturally unrecognizable from the one she had left in 1997. The city's skyline was now dominated by the glass and steel towers of the Porta Nuova district, and the fashion industry had shifted from the salotti of the elite to the digital algorithmic dominance of social media. Upon her release, she was immediately confronted by a television crew outside her lawyer's office. In a moment of chilling archival clarity, a reporter asked her why she hadn't killed Maurizio herself. Patrizia, adjusting her sunglasses with the same calculated poise she had used on the deck of the Creole, replied, "My eyesight is not very good. I didn't want to miss." It was a statement that confirmed the technical coldness of her ambition remained intact. The legacy of the House of Gucci in 2026 is one of total corporate detachment. The family members, once the architects of every stitch, are now entirely absent from the company's operations. The brand is a subsidiary of Kering, managed by professional CEOs and creative directors who treat the family's violent history as brand heritage or lore to be utilized in marketing campaigns. The technical infrastructure of the brand now spans over 500 stores globally, with an annual revenue exceeding $10 billion. The interlocking G logo is no longer a coat of arms. It is a globally recognized QR code for status. The ruins of the family's personal holdings have been liquidated. The Olympic Tower penthouse was sold to an international investor, and the Creole was eventually acquired by a billionaire who spent millions to exorcise its dark history through a total technical refit of its interior systems. Patrizia's current life in Milan is a study in the ruins of the name. She lives in a modest, albeit well-appointed apartment, often seen walking through the Via Monte Napoleone, the very street she once ruled. She is a living anachronism, typically accompanied by a large blue and yellow macaw perched on her shoulder. The parrot, a tropical bird whose natural lifespan can reach 50 years, is her last remaining accessory. The technical cost of her life is now covered by a legal technicality, a 1993 agreement she signed with Maurizio before his death, which the Italian courts ruled was still valid despite her role in his murder. She receives an annual payment of approximately $1.2 million from Maurizio's estate, a fiscal irony that ensures the man she killed continues to fund her existence in 2026. The secondary characters of the drama have vanished into obscurity. Pina Oriema, the psychic, was released and returned to the shadows of Naples. The hitman, Benedetto Ciraulo, remains in prison, a forgotten casualty of a high-stakes divorce. The daughters, Alessandra and Allegra, reside in a state of self-imposed exile, managing the remnants of the Gucci real estate empire through a series of holding companies designed to minimize public scrutiny. The archive of the Gucci family is now a museum piece. The original workshops in Florence are tourist attractions where the artisan history is sold to a mass-market audience that has largely forgotten the blood on the marble of Via Palestro. In the macro context of the 21st century luxury market, the story of Patrizia and Maurizio is the ultimate cautionary tale of brand cannibalism. It demonstrates the technical limit of a family dynasty. The moment the brand becomes more valuable than the people who created it, the people become expendable. Patrizia Reggiani attempted to stop time and freeze the Gucci name in her own image. She used the technology of murder to prevent a corporate evolution she couldn't control. But the industry moved on, more profitable and more soulless than ever, leaving her as a relic in a city that respects only the price tag. "It is better to cry in a Rolls-Royce than to be happy on a bicycle," she had said. In the end, Patrizia Reggiani achieved her goal. She has the Rolls-Royce, the Vison, and the name. But as she walks through the ruins of her empire, the only thing she has left to talk to is a parrot that repeats words she no longer has the power to make true.